Greetings in the name of Christ. In this video, I want to talk with you just a little bit about another chapter in Dean Flemming's book, Contextualization in the New Testament. You have been assigned one chapter out of his book, which is the last chapter, but there's another chapter that he has on Paul and culture, and I want to talk to you just a little bit about that. Didn't require the entire book. It's a great book, but we're trying to keep the cost of books down, and you already have a reading load that is quite sufficient, so did not require you to buy this book and read the whole thing, but it's a really good book. I do recommend it. Dean Flemming, Contextualization in the New Testament. And in his chapter on Paul and culture, Flemming suggests that as he reads Paul's writings, he discerns that there are at least four processes at work as the way Paul views it, in which the gospel interacts with Paul's cultural world. And these four attitudes toward culture are processes are affirming, relativizing, confronting, and transforming. First of all, let's talk about affirming. Flemming suggests that the way he reads Paul in the New Testament, Paul assumes that God's active presence in the created world includes cultures, human cultures, so that far from rejecting human culture as merely the product of the fall, Paul affirms cultural particularity, that's a tough word, affirms cultural particularity and uses it to bring the message of Christ to the world. And so Flemming suggests that Paul believes that believers should show respect for cultural and ethnic distinctions and not erect any unnecessary barriers to the gospel. Now, the second attitude toward culture or process that might be going on as the gospel interacts with culture is that of relativizing. But not only do we affirm culture, not only does the gospel affirm culture, but cultural distinctions are also relativized in light of the gospel. Paul believes that God has done something radically new in Christ, and that this signals an end to the old order of things. And so being in Christ means that there's a new set of relationships for believers, a new set of distinctions for believers, etc. And so every culture in this sense becomes provisional in the light of the cross. So first we affirm cultural particularity, but then after affirming it, we also say, now, it still looks different in the light of the cross. It doesn't look exactly the same. And if all social relationships have only relative significance, then Christians are free to live out their calling and bear witness to the gospel in whatever cultural situation they are found. And so that's one of the reasons this particular attitude toward culture is important. And then a third attitude toward culture, or a third process that takes place as the gospel interacts with culture, is that of culture being confronted. It is true that culture provides the locus, or the place where God's gracious activity takes place through His Spirit. But culture is also the theater for human sinfulness, and we do not ignore this. And we also know that the world, or in Greek, the cosmos, in which culture operates, is enemy-occupied territory. So it is important to see that although we affirm culture, it is relativized in the light of Christ, and we must recognize that we cannot simply equate culture with something that is good or with what Paul means by the world. What he means by the world, the cosmos, that which is inhabited by demonic beings, for example, and heavenly angelic beings at war with one another, where the spiritual warfare takes place in the heavenly realms, for example, that is different from culture. Culture is what human creatures have tried to make out of God's good creation. And we haven't always done it well because of sin, but it's what we try to make out of human culture. But the cosmos is something beyond that. In any event, related to God's redemptive purposes, we know that culture must be not only affirmed, and we understand that it's relative in the light of the cross, but it also at times must be challenged and confronted. In this sense, then, we're saying that the gospel speaks to human culture with a strong no as well as a strong yes. And then one fourth attitude toward culture, or process that takes place as the gospel interacts with culture, which Flemming believes he sees in Paul, is the transformation of culture. The gospel's judgment on culture in the confrontation place or phase is not the last word. Paul has an optimism of grace in which he is open to the potential for cultures to be reformed from within. Flemming believes that as Paul writes, Paul does not express that he wants us to create a separate Christian culture, but rather that Paul would prefer we create a prophetic subculture within our own cultures. How might these subcultures be prophetic? Well, there are at least two ways that Flemming sees Paul doing. One is the doing and recommending. One is the transformation of cultural language, the re-signifying or re-signing of the value or the meaning of words. What do they mean? Lord, Kyrios, meant one thing before Christ that referred to Caesar, but after Christ, Kyrios should more aptly refer to Jesus. So that's an example of trying to re-signify language. There are many others. So we try to transform cultural language as a subcultural prophetic voice. Secondly, we work for a transformation of moral behavior. And we won't get into all of that, but it's obvious that Paul's writings are filled with ethical implications. I mean, for example, the book of Colossians chapters 1 and 2 talk about all kinds of grand things that take place for us in Christ. And then chapter 3 starts with therefore, or something to that effect in Greek. Therefore, this being such, you should now live in such and such a manner. But because of what Christ has done both in and for you, you should and can live differently. And Paul's writings are filled with this kind of thing. So there's a transformation of cultural language and there's a transformation of moral behavior. And so for Paul, the gospel engages all dimensions of culture: worldview, language, symbols, religion, politics, social practices, ethics. But this does not happen on a macro level, Flemming says. Flemming really believes that Paul is not arguing for this to take place on a macro level, but rather to happen as transformed communities of believers live out the gospel in the culture that they share with the unbelieving world. And so as you're thinking about, reading about contextualization and all those things, I wanted you to hear about this particular chapter in Flemming's book as well. Hope you enjoyed it. Again, I recommend the book, Dean Flemming, Contextualization in the New Testament. God bless.